All right. Well, we're turning then to the unit on realism, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about just what realism means and how it differs from idealism. You probably have some idea of realism just from the very word itself, but or maybe you've been introduced to realism in art class, and there is a sort of correspondence there, because realism in art is showing things the way they really are, including those things that are not so attractive. And so is the case with political philosophy too. Sort of at a basic level, realism is showing things as they really are. Now, realism comes into existence in opposition to idealism. Okay. Whether you're looking at it in ancient Greece, we've already seen an example of realism with somebody like Callicles or even Gorgias. Okay. Or whether we're looking at Machiavelli, they're always part of the realist's theme is anti-idealism. Okay. The way that the realist defines himself or herself is in opposition to this other idea, at least partly. Okay. Which they believe to be mistaken. And so with Machiavelli, that's certainly the case. He had studied the ancient idealists. He knew well Plato's philosophy. He knew well about medieval authors who had written about utopias or Christian ideals, and he was going to reject them. And he did so very openly. Now let's sort of review what idealism is so that we can see realism in contrast. As we learned from Plato, an idealist does not necessarily think that the world is always good. Most idealists see the world as very flawed, actually. Okay? So they don't go around thinking, oh, they're not like Don Quixote, this is the best of all worlds, but rather, oh, wait a minute, that was Voltaire's Candide. Anyway, they have a more skeptical view of the world than that, and they expect people to be evil and bad and selfish and so forth. Idealism comes from the way the person sees his or her role in relation to the badness that's going on in the world. Okay? So the idealist sees his or her role as a critic, as somebody who criticizes the behavior and the ideas that other people have that he or she believes is immoral, selfish, and so forth. Okay? And in response to what they believe to be bad ideas, they put forth standards of right and wrong. They put forward moral standards or standards of justice. So we saw very clearly with Socrates that he was dealing with many people in this dialogue, the Gorgias, who were openly espousing self-interest, questioning the very idea of justice, advocating that the strong should rule, and so forth. And Socrates' response to that was, you need to change your mind. Okay? I'm going to tell you why you should change your mind. I'm going to tell you what justice really is and why it's good for you, because I want to try to persuade you that you're making a mistake. So that's the position of the idealist. The reason why the idealist puts forth those ideals is to critique and to try to bring about change in that less than perfect world. Okay? Now, as we saw with Plato, again, idealists tend to be moral absolutists. Remember when Socrates said, it can't be both good and bad? Something can't be both good and bad at the same time. It has to be one or the other. Okay? There is no good and bad at the same time. There's no shades of gray. Plato was looking for that absolute standard of justice, and he was not one who would say, well, this is my idea of justice, but I acknowledge that other people have equally valid ideas. Okay? Now, there's one valid idea, of justice, and he thought that he had discovered it, and that he had explained it. Okay? So this is an area that the realist thinks gets the idealist into trouble, this moral absolutism. Okay? When a person is morally rigid, so to speak, they can be very dangerous, says the realist, to themselves and even to other people. Okay? So by contrast, the realist also sees the world as struggle, but the realist tends to emphasize this struggle even more than the idealist. Okay? It is a fight, a war, as Thomas Hobbes put it, a war of all against all. Okay? And that struggle sets the rules of the game. Okay? How other people are behaving should give us a clue as to how to behave ourselves. Instead of fighting against that behavior, it should inform us as to how to behave and how to behave even more effectively than others. Okay? So as we saw with Callicles, for instance, who is a realist, the strongest, they usually think, will prevail. Okay? Whether it's right or not, whether it makes moral sense or not, when we look at the world, we see that those who are the stronger are the ones who win power and control. Okay? Some of them go further, like Callicles does, and said, not only will the strong prevail, but they should prevail, okay? Because they're the better sort. Machiavelli actually doesn't go that extra step, really. He simply says, this is the way the world works. Okay? Therefore, you either conform to that and have a chance of winning, or you lose. Okay? So realists like Machiavelli, as well as those in the ancient world that we have seen, thought that moral standards were actually dangerous to the person who held them. Okay? Now that sounds kind of funny. Okay? It sounds kind of odd to say moral standards could ever be dangerous. You've got to remember that they're mainly thinking about the political world, or any part of human life that is about competition. The same thing would be said about the business world. Does it mean that, say, family relations are a battle of all against all necessarily, and that morality has no place in family relations? No. Okay. As a matter of fact, realists tend to count on individuals, at least in their families and in their friendships, being fairly moral and fair with each other most of the time. But what they're talking about is the arena of politics and business in which competition is natural. Okay? And in that arena, they say moral standards not only are not effective, but they're also actually dangerous. Okay? They're dangerous to the leader who tries to maintain those standards, because he is likely simply to lose his position. He is likely to be defeated by those who will not, conform to moral rules, who will do whatever it takes. Okay? So such a person is simply setting themselves up for failure if they are rigidly good. Okay? And so he advises actually that a person should be very flexible morally, not be attached to moral standards. Okay? Now the aim of realists is not to change hearts or souls. That's the idealist goal, is to change people inwardly, to change their character. Instead, the realist doesn't really think that that's a worthwhile goal at all. In fact, it's not possible in their view to change people inwardly. Okay? People's basic self-interestedness and egoism is something that's very natural in their view to human beings. You can't change it. Instead, you need to change people's behavior, okay? Their outward behavior. And you can do that, for instance, if you're a leader, by setting firm laws, firm punishments for violating those laws, and incentives for doing things you want people to do. And you can do all that without ever even concerning yourself with their inner state. Okay? And Machiavelli, I think, believes that he can manipulate the behavior of leaders with his advice simply by showing them if they behave a certain way, they will obtain what they want, which is power. Okay? In his view, more than money, it's power. Okay. Now, having said this, you probably assume that Machiavelli is a real pessimist. And yes, in many ways he is. He's certainly pessimistic about human nature, about human behavior, about the chances for perfection. He doesn't believe we have a chance for perfection. Okay? On the other hand, in a strange way, realists are optimists, and even more optimistic than the idealists. because they actually think that we can change our situation permanently. Socrates and Plato were not so hopeful. What they were hoping for was that maybe some individual leaders would sometimes be persuaded of their advice and become better leaders. But they had no vision or plan for some sort of ultimate revolutionary change in the way people are governed, in the effectiveness of government regardless of who's in charge. They laid such a heavy emphasis on the character of the leader that good government was bound to come and go depending upon how smart and good the leader was. On the other hand, though, realists like Machiavelli place more emphasis on the power of knowledge to not just change the individual sometimes, but to change the way lots of people think about government, and to change maybe even permanently the way we are governed. Machiavelli thought that if we just once could acknowledge that self-interest really rules human behavior, that we could create political ideas and institutions that would harness that self-interest. Okay? If self-interest is a permanent feature of the human condition, and if we can come up with principles of government and institutions of government that really effectively harness and use that self-interest, then we can change permanently the effectiveness of government. Machiavelli really thought that he had discovered something new here, something that other people had not seen before. Both in The Prince and in the other book on politics that he wrote, The Discourses, there's a great deal of hopefulness in the way that he talks about the future. Okay? If the leaders and even the people can see the reasons for the type of government that he prescribes, we don't have to go through these cycles of rise and decline anymore. Okay? But we can have a government that provides stability and keeps going. Okay? Machiavelli admired Rome because Rome had a republican form of government that harnessed conflict between the rich and the poor, for instance. And it lasted for hundreds of years. The republican government did, but it didn't last forever. And in the Discourses, Machiavelli says, now we can take that form of government and modify it to a certain extent, and then it may last forever, okay? Using political science, okay? His political science. So in The Prince, the theme is that rightly understood, the interest of the prince coincides with the interests of the people, and both parties should see that it's in their self-interest to do certain things. The prince to not be overly cruel to the people to obey the prince and support him, okay, in a sort of contractual type of arrangement, okay? Though he never uses that term. And in the Discourses, he focuses on splitting different powers up in government, somewhat like the American Constitution's separation of powers. In this case, though, the splitting up would be between classes, more like the Roman Constitution, between a Senate and a plebeian assembly. But there has to be some way of splitting people's interest up and then constitutionally forcing them to compete with each other in a lawful manner, okay? So that no one party gets the upper hand, and the conflict that could be civil war ends up being a legal conflict in a political setting. So Machiavelli is a precursor for, say, the American founders, who definitely carried with them the same idea Machiavelli had about human nature. They thought people could be counted upon to be self-interested. They didn't think you could build a constitution on ideals. You had to build it on an assumption of self-interest. They divided the government up into separate powers, and they created a constitution in which these powers compete with each other and have checks and balances upon each other. That's basically a Machiavellian idea, okay? And it assumes self-interest and not this view of the common good, okay? I think the American founders hoped that our leaders would have the common good at heart, but they certainly didn't count on it, and they say so repeatedly in the Federalist Papers and other letters and speeches in which they, discussed what they were doing when they created the Constitution. Okay. There is a criticism of realism, and you will see this coming out in the video on Thursday. The critic of realism will say, don't the realists have a distorted view of the world? Aren't they really exaggerating the degree of selfishness that people actually have? Yes, we know that people are selfish. Sometimes people outright vicious, okay, depending upon the situation. But there's this other part of human nature which is good and which admires justice and wants peace and so forth. And realists tend to ignore that. Okay? So they say that they're being too extreme. They're not realistic enough, in other words, because they ignore these other factors. Now, the realists, in response to this criticism, say, no, we don't ignore it, we just aren't counting on it. Okay, there's a difference. In fact, we'll see Machiavelli very much acknowledging that that people can love justice, are religious, okay, that these things are very important to them, and when they exist and are useful, you should use them. But he is not going to build a political theory around the assumption of goodness, okay? So he assumes badness because he believes that's a lot safer. Okay, so that would be his answer. He's not ignoring the fact that that people are sometimes good, but rather he's not counting on it. Okay? To count on it would be dangerous. Okay, before we move on into some history about Machiavelli, let me just ask if you all have any questions about realism generally, what realism means, or what the motivation for it is. Realists, I think, believe that they are saving us from ourselves, okay? They have, interestingly enough, I think, a very moral motivation. And I hope that that comes through in your reading of Machiavelli, because sometimes when we read Machiavelli and other realists, we say, oh, yuck, it's kind of ugly. There's so much of an assumption of badness that we react negatively. But yet Machiavelli and other realists are trying to save us from conflict. They're trying to save us from needless war. They're trying to save us from violence. Okay? They just think that the means to that end have to include sometimes what we would think of as immoral behavior. Okay, well, Machiavelli is a Renaissance figure. His dates here are 1469 to 1527. So at the end of his life would have been about the same time that the Protestant Reformation was happening in Germany with Martin Luther. Machiavelli, in some of his writing, displays a little bit of the same mood or the same attitude towards the church as the Protestant reformers, but he's not, as far as I can tell, aware of the details of the Protestant Reformation, okay? But at the time that he's writing, there's a lot of criticism of the church because the church was, in lots of ways, not being very effective at that time because of corruption, which we'll talk about. It was losing the faith of a lot of people. People were becoming more openly critical of it, so it's not surprising that he would be too. So that's going on in the background. He comes from a city-state in Italy called Florence. And you have to understand that at this time, Italy was not a united country, but it was a whole collection of city-states and republics, principalities and republics, I should say. And some were more powerful than others. I'm going to put up here just for a minute the map of Italy that's in your book. And you can see here that it was really divided up and very unequally. Some of the kingdoms were very large, others up here in the north were very small. Here in this gray area here are the papal states. Those were the lands that were controlled by the church. And the church at this time, of course now it's just the Vatican City, okay, very small place. But then it stretched from coast to coast in the smack dab in the middle of the Italian peninsula, okay? And we'll learn more about this as time goes by, but the church was a political as well as a religious entity at this time, made alliances, used troops in battle, took over territory, and in fact this area here, the Romagna, becomes very important in Machiavelli's discussion of how to conquer. Okay? So Italy was a place where there was enough fighting going on just among, I should say, these various cities and principalities. Okay? They were fighting with each other a lot over territorial disputes, family problems. Okay? So there was a lot of little battles going on, and but none of them was strong enough to get the upper hand. Okay? So part of Machiavelli's problem with the Italian situation is it's not a unified country. Other countries in Europe are becoming more consolidated and therefore more powerful. And they were intervening in Italian affairs, especially France and Spain. They were coming in and intervening in Italian affairs, sometimes trying to conquer or at least intimidate some of these other Italian cities, creating alliances with them, installing puppet governments in some and so forth. So Italy was weak relative to these other countries because it was not united. So he has a real problem with the Italians fighting amongst themselves. And one of his great goals in this book is to convince some leader that he needs to go on a conquest of Italy, that he needs to actually unify Italy, if needs be by force, which it probably would have to be. It was not a good situation, and he says that the papal states, that the territory of the church, made the problem worse because the church was not quite powerful enough to take over all of Italy, but it was just powerful enough, and of course its geographic position was just right to interfere with anybody else trying to do that. So the church was a very important issue for him, and what to do about it obsessed his mind, actually. Machiavelli had a political career, but it was not exactly the way he would have liked. I think Machiavelli would have liked to have always been the right-hand man of a prince or of some other leader, the leader of the republic. Okay? He wanted to be working for somebody at a very close level, a high level, where he could give advice. I don't think he ever really wanted to be a prince himself, and there's no way he could have been given his background, but he certainly wanted more influence than he ever had. The most influence he ever had was in the Republic period of Florence. Florence was a republic between 1498 and 1512. Okay? Now what that means really is that it was an aristocracy of sorts. The aristocracy chose leaders, from a small group of leaders, to run the state. So this was not a democracy, but it was not a principality either. It was a elected group of people, okay, running this government. He liked that government a lot, okay, and while it was in power, he was an ambassador. And in that capacity, he took a lot of trips across Europe. He met many other leaders, many other ambassadors. So he had a lot of experience dealing with people from other countries, dealing with very difficult political issues. Sorry about that typo. He met Pope Julius II himself and observed their situation. And he worked most of all to protect Florence from that foreign intervention from Spain and France. Okay? This was always difficult because these people wanted nothing more than to intervene and to rule however they could, okay, in Italian affairs. And so they couldn't fight them directly, obviously. Okay? So they had to do whatever they could to keep them at bay. And that was a very difficult diplomatic assignment. Okay, well, Machiavelli failed. Well, it wasn't just his fault; it was a lot of people's fault. Or maybe it was inevitable. But the Spaniards invaded the Florentine area in 1512, And their aim was to set up a government that would be friendly to them and would do what they wanted. Okay. So at this time, the Republican government was destroyed, and a principality was installed by the Spaniards. And there was an old family in Italy that has just an incredible past and present, and that is the de Medici family. They had ruled in the past, and so the Spaniards brought them back into power. Okay. And of course, they agreed to cooperate with them. Okay. Now, of course, Machiavelli, having been an employee of the previous government and having openly supported that government, was fired. But not only was he fired, but he was also imprisoned and tortured by this government. Now, how that happened was that the de Medici family didn't really know exactly who might conspire against them, who was, say, an ardent Republican, okay, and who would just simply go away. Okay. But they knew that there was a chance that people who really liked the previous government would attempt to destabilize their power. And so what they did was they got a list of people from somewhere, of people that might, just might, agitate or try to destabilize their government. People who were former employees like Machiavelli, or people who had just spoken out or written in favor of the government. And they went out and they arrested them all. And without trial, they, killed some, tortured others, and generally tried to make a very strong statement that nobody ought to oppose them. Okay? So that happened to Machiavelli. He was not killed, obviously, but he was treated very badly. And you would think that he would despise the de Medicis and never wish to be a part of their government based on how he was treated. But he actually seems to admire what they did. He's able to distance himself from his own treatment enough to be able to say that sometimes the government must do these things in order to establish authority. And he actually wants to work for the de Medici family. After he was released, he went to a country estate that he owned. He had always lived in the city before, but he had land in the country, and he made money from this land, mainly from a chopping down of wood. So he had a place to go, and basically he was told to get out of Florence. He was not welcome there. Okay? So he went to his cottage in the country, and there, because he had nothing else to do, he set himself to writing. Machiavelli was a man of action. He preferred to be in the government. He preferred to be having influence directly through his actions. He was not first and foremost an intellectual, although he was very educated, okay? Self-educated. Okay? But given that he could not be in government at this point, and only because he was in exile, did he turn himself to this concentrated effort to write down his ideas. Okay? So I guess we have the de Medicis to thank for The Prince and the Discourses, and he also wrote a book called The Art of War and some plays. Well, he did this partly because he wanted the de Medicis to see how smart he was, but I think partly, maybe even largely, because he knew that he had ideas that he believed would be useful not just for his time, but for all time. He actually says things in his writings that would suggest that he saw himself as part of an elite group of people who had had this type of influence throughout history. He saw himself as a political philosopher at this point, sort of bestowing upon the rest of us his ideas. Okay? So there's a timeliness to them, but also a timelessness to his ideas. Okay. These are his two greatest works, the one we will read, and also the thicker one, the Discourses, The full title is Discourses on the First 10 Books of Titus Livius, ancient Roman historian. And I'll talk about the discourses. We don't have the time to read them in this class, but I will talk about how they relate to the prince. Okay, Machiavelli, always desiring to get back into service, hoped the de Medicis would call him back. Now, this is a man who never gives up, okay? I don't know about you, but I would just stay out there in the country and forget about politics, okay? But Machiavelli never gave up. The number one most important thing for Machiavelli was to be back there having influence, okay? And also, as you'll see from the video and from the letter to Vittori, he's a very urban person, okay? He hates the country, okay? So he wants to be back in the city with his friends, doing the city things that he loves. In 1525, he wrote a history of Florence for the de Medicis, okay? They actually asked him to write this. This may have been because Machiavelli had been urging friends like Francesco to say something about him to them, okay? In a lot of different ways, he's trying to get his message to them that he wasn't a bad guy, that he wasn't against their power, and he just wanted a job. And however that happened, okay, they did commission this work from him. It was not a political work, though, so it was both a compliment and an insult, okay, because they were basically saying, we don't want your political advice, but if you want to do something for us, write this history, okay, which, of course, they might never read. But he did do that. We have that. But guess what? Just as it looked as though perhaps he was going to sneak back in there, in 1527, the de Medicis were overturned by people who advocated republicanism. Okay? So the republic was restored. Now Machiavelli is, he's well known for trying to schmooze the de Medicis. Okay? And so they don't want him. Okay? The new government doesn't want him. He's an outcast all around. And this is a character trait Machiavelli has that comes through in his advice to the people, okay, that are reading his books. Be flexible. Principles don't matter, okay? What matters is, that you're effective, that you get power and so forth. And he acted upon that. Okay, he thought Republican government was superior, but when a principality was in power, he had no problem appealing to them and giving them advice and trying to get into their good graces. When they were defeated, though, Machiavelli had a problem, because from the point of view of the Republicans, he was now fickle. He was not loyal, okay? What did he stand for? So he had a problem, and I think that is potentially one problem with that moral flexibility, okay, is that there are other folks out there who expect some sort of bottom line, okay? And if you're too flexible, you get the reputation for standing for nothing, okay? And apparently it didn't work for Machiavelli. Now, we don't know exactly what he died from. Some people suggest he just was simply so disappointed he gave up. I doubt that. But that same year, within 1 month of realizing that he wasn't going to get back into the city, he died in 1527. Okay. Any questions about Machiavelli's life so far?
He died of old age. I mean, he was 98.
Well, no. He wasn't that old.
1429? 1469?
1469. Oh. Yeah.
Okay, I wrote that down.
He wasn't that. A lot of philosophers do live to be pretty old, but he did not. But I remember, somebody saying that he had a stomach problem. I mean, back in these days, people didn't know what the heck killed most people. They didn't have a name for most of it. Stomach ailment, lying in bed. There's some apocryphal stories about Machiavelli being in pain, lying in bed, and making a deathbed confession, et cetera, et cetera. We really don't know what killed him. I don't tend to believe that disappointment kills people, but, that's another possibility.
What did he have to confess?
Just that he had been rather critical of the church. He had sort of mocked some of the Christian beliefs. He had done things like openly admired paganism because it was more politically effective. So he had that kind of thing to confess. Personal issues, perhaps as well, because although he was married, he had a reputation for being, a lover of women. So maybe he had some personal issues as well. But, everybody in that situation has something to confess, okay? But I think that probably that's apocryphal, too. In other words, there's no evidence that actually happened. A lot of people, right after Machiavelli died, people started to use his name as a sort of epithet, as a bad word. Shakespeare picks it up and calls evil people Machiavels, okay, because of his advice, which seems so anti-moral or unchristian and so forth. So I think that the story about his confession is sort of a story that people make up because they thought that Machiavelli was an evil man. Okay? We'll talk about whether Machiavelli was really an evil man, whether it's a moral problem to issue this kind of advice or not is a major question. Okay. Anything else so far about Machiavelli? Mm-hmm.
I might be getting the quote mixed up, but did he say something like, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely?
No, he didn't say that. I think that's Lord Acton. I'm pretty sure. Actually, he didn't have this concern about power corrupting morally, and that's what that quote is about, is that, if you get absolute power, you almost can't help but be corrupted by it. He was concerned about people becoming so in love with their power that they made irrational decisions. But that's a little different. In other words, not that the morality was an issue, but that if a prince gets so much power, he can become more a lover of himself to such an extent that he starts making unwise choices and he loses his power. Okay? Like surrounding himself with too much luxury, diverting his attention from military and political matters with entertainments and so forth. So he had that concern, okay, but not the intent of that quote, which is to warn against moral corruption. Okay. Anything else? Okay. He's famous for saying the ends justify the means, okay. Which he actually doesn't say exactly like that, but he comes pretty close to saying it in a variety of ways. That you shouldn't think about the means so much and whether they are moral and good that you limit your actions and then become ineffective. Okay, well, so what we have from Machiavelli is a man with political experience. This is something Socrates did not have. Okay? He did not have hardly any direct political experience, whereas Machiavelli has a great deal, and he has seen it in all sorts of different governments, in all sorts of different cultures as an ambassador. Okay? He's an astute observer of political behavior, to be sure. We could all learn something from Machiavelli's powers of observation and his instinct about people's motivations and so forth. He gets his examples from his direct experience and also from Roman history. So as you're reading this book, you will find that he has all sorts of tales about Italian politics as illustrations, but then sometimes he'll launch into an ancient Roman or even Greek example. They're both experience in his view. You experience life directly, but you can also experience through the reading of history things that you have not lived through. Okay. Now, the way that we should look at these is as illustrations of his points. Okay. Lots of times when students read this book, they think, "Oh my God, how can I possibly, even begin to remember all of this stuff?" Right? Because there's so much historical detail in the stories. Okay. But the reason why he puts them in there is as examples to explain and to illustrate his point. Okay? They are the data, in other words, that he uses to derive his principles and to illustrate them. Okay? Sometimes they are not accurate. Sometimes he gets history wrong. Okay? There have been whole articles and books pointing out, that he doesn't get, like, say, Agathocles of Syracuse correct. Okay? But he knows that, okay? What he does is he takes the historical data, and if it doesn't quite fit the point he wants to make, he will change some of the details, okay? So you're not going to get the most accurate history from Machiavelli, but that's not the point, okay? He's not a historian. He's just telling you stories to lead you to the conclusions that he wants, okay? So that's how you should view them. Machiavelli, as I said before, is a man from the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. And to a certain extent, this is a sort of negative commentary on the time that came before, the Middle Ages or the medieval period. The medieval period had a lot of learning and a lot of artistry and so forth, and sometimes we forget that when we call it the Dark Ages, as though nothing ever happened, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But what was going on during that period, for the most part, was that all that learning and artistry and so forth was concentrated in the church. Okay? There wasn't much going on outside the church for a lot of reasons. Europe was politically unstable. It suffered from the plague at certain times, wiping out a number of people. It was just a time when, for a lot of reasons, learning and industry couldn't spread, okay? Beyond the church. Okay? But during the Renaissance, okay, the economies of Europe are getting better. Okay? People are becoming better off. Okay? And because of this, there is some breathing space, some room for non-church people, for people outside of the church, to also learn, to also grow and develop. Okay? And also, as you know, this was a period of time, as I've already stated, of growing criticism of the church as well. Okay? And so there was a freedom of thought developing, as a sort of protesting type of freedom of thought developing, okay? In which people were more inclined to explore the pre-Christian past, that is, the pagan past of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And so during the Renaissance, the Italians first, because they were the first to enter into this period, okay? The Italians and then others in Europe began to explore the philosophy, the art, the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. And out of that comes what we call humanism, a sort of reorientation of intellectual thought and art towards human experience and away from religious themes. Okay? So, Machiavelli is a part of all that. He doesn't start the Renaissance. He's writing at sort of the beginning of this period of time, so he certainly plays his part. But it's a social development that's going on all over the place, okay? And especially in his Italy. Okay? Now, the Renaissance, as I said, shifts from God as the center of the intellectual universe to man as the center. And so, for instance, in art, there's still a great deal of religious art. That's very beautiful. But alongside that religious art, you start to get more that focuses on ordinary people doing ordinary things. Okay? And sometimes even some pagan themes. You see paintings of ancient gods and mythical figures and so forth coming out. Okay? There's a celebration of the human figure, of human beauty, and all that. Okay? So it was a wonderful time, you know, in the development of intellectual history. Okay. Any questions about the Renaissance? you'll get a good picture of this as when you see the video, and we'll talk more about it too. Hopefully that I'm going to get another one on the Renaissance in time to show the class towards the end of this unit. Okay, this book, The Prince, is a fairly small work, especially in relation to his other major work, The Discourses, which is probably about 4 or 5 times this long. But it is in a particular form, a literary form, and that's part of the reason why it's short. Okay? During the medieval period, a literary form had developed, which we call the mirror. Lots of people, mainly theologians, members of the church hierarchy, priests and so forth, but also some lay people, men and women at court, had written short little books of advice. Okay? Lots of them, as I've been doing some reading on chivalry, I've been doing some research. A lot of these books had to do with very concrete advice, like don't pick your teeth at the table. Don't stick your finger in your nose and then grab some food from a common plate. So they were really, really basic stuff, trying to teach the aristocracy to have some manners, because you get this picture of these medieval people, just grabbing big chunks of meat and wolfing them down, throwing them over their shoulder, right? Probably not that far from accurate. So part of it was manners. A great deal of it was manners. Okay? How to carry yourself, how to behave at the table and in other situations. But as time went by, these mirror books also became more about the values that you should have. Okay? How to be a good prince, a good person at court, a good courtier. Okay? How to be somebody who reflected Christian values in particular. Okay? So a couple of examples of this would be Baldassare Castiglione's The Courtier, which is still published by Penguin Press and still a fairly popular book, and Christine de Pizan's The City of the Ladies, and she also wrote several other books dealing with how women, men, common people, the nobility, how everyone should act. And Christine was not just interested in the theological or the Christian side, but also began to bring back in the ancient philosophy. So she sort of spanned the medieval and the Renaissance way of thinking. Okay? Well, anyway, these mirror books were short. They told how to behave. They're called mirrors because you can basically take them and read them, and by doing that, it's like you're looking into a mirror and examining yourself. Okay? And so you're supposed to try to change and conform more to the ideal. Machiavelli's book is kind of like a mirror because the prince is supposed to read it and supposed to change to conform more to Machiavelli's way of thinking. But it's not at all about moral virtue, Christian values, or anything like that. So what he does is he takes the form of the mirror very consciously, and he changes its content. He uses the form, but changes the content. And he does that to make a statement about the books of the past. Okay? This is a mirror, but it's a very different mirror to look into. So it is a Renaissance mirror. Okay? And to that extent, it is a radical break with tradition. And the most clear way that we can see that break is in his use of the term virtu, which is translated virtue. In your translation, whenever Machiavelli uses virtu, it's put in brackets, because your translator makes it into many different words in the translation, which I wish he wouldn't do, but he puts it in brackets because he wants you to know how frequently Machiavelli uses that term. So frequently that he thought that it was tedious, okay, and had to change it to other words. Okay. Machiavelli uses that term all the time, and it's very, very significant because virtu in the past had meant that moral Christian virtue. And Machiavelli takes that same word and gives it a completely different meaning. That meaning is something more like effectiveness, ability, or prowess. So he does that very purposefully. And it's a critique of the previous notion of virtue. So we'll actually spend quite a bit of time dealing with what does Machiavelli mean by virtue, okay? Because it's, it certainly isn't what we normally think of. It's more like the word virtuoso, who is somebody who is really skilled at, say, playing the violin. That's more like what he's saying. The politician that he wants is a political virtuoso. Now, in this book, Machiavelli claims that he has discovered a radically new way of viewing politics. Actually, it's only partly radically new. Because, as you can see from reading the Gorgias, realism has been around for a long time. Okay? His view of human nature is nothing new. Even his reaction to it is nothing new. Okay? But he does try to come up with something new by coming up with a political science which will benefit the people. Okay? With that view of human nature, he wishes actually to benefit the people. Maybe not for their own sake, but maybe for the sake of stability anyway. He is a political scientist. He says that the radically new thing is that he is not going to talk about what ought to be or what should be, but only he's going to talk about what is. So he will not put forth any sort of utopian picture of the world like Plato's Republic. He will not give any moral ideals. He will only discuss what is useful and what actually works, regardless of its supposed morality or immorality. For his time, perhaps that was shocking, but I think that you can see that what inspired him partly was that ancient philosophy, and from ancient philosophy, such a statement is not shocking or new. Okay? So I think what is new is what he wants to do with this insight. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the letter, because you're going to be exposed to more of these ideas on Thursday. This man was a Republican, an advocate of the Republican government. He had worked in that government. He was a friend of Machiavelli, but we don't think that he was a best buddy of Machiavelli. Okay? There wasn't necessarily the hope that Francesco would do anything for him. It would be kind of like if you're sitting here in Manhattan, Kansas, and you remember that you know somebody in Washington, D.C. You haven't seen him for like 3 or 4 years, but you really need a favor, and so you email him or call him up and see if he remembers you, and if, maybe not if he remembers you, but if he likes you enough to do anything for you, okay? So that's Francesco. Now, Machiavelli writes him this rather pathetic letter, and I'm using that term not to mean it's a, like disgusting letter, but, it's designed to bring out the pity in Francesco. Okay. First, he displays his view on what he calls fortune and human beings' relationship to it. And he says, I'll just put this up here for a second. Since fortune wants to control everything, she evidently wants to be left a free hand. Meanwhile, we should keep our own counsel and not get in her way, and wait until she allows human beings to have a say in the course of events. That will be the time for you to work harder and to keep a closer eye on events, and for me to leave my country house and say, here I am. Okay. That's an important little section about fortune. It shows you Machiavelli's attitude towards it. Fortune is chance. It is that aspect of life which is out of our control. And a great theme in Machiavelli's writing is what to do about that aspect of life. You know, for some people it's huge. Fortune controls almost everything. They feel as though nothing is in their control. Okay? And if bad things happen, they say, well, that was fate or God's will or whatever. Okay, but I can't do anything about it. Machiavelli, as we'll see, thought that Italians were extremely fatalistic, that they thought too much about fortune and too little about what they themselves could do. So this quote gives us an idea of what Machiavelli's attitude is towards it. He says, fortune wants to control everything, okay? And she wants to be left a free hand. But though we should not get in her way, we should watch carefully and wait for our opportunity. His attitude is, yes, there are some things you can't do anything about, like I'm in exile, I was kicked out, and these bad things happen to me. But if I just go away, I'll be missing lots of opportunities. I wait until I see some way of using what's happening to my advantage, okay, to think creatively enough to be able to see my advantage in what other people might see as bad fortune. Okay? So he asks Francesco to watch for him as well. And if there is any opportunity in the twists and turns of Florentine politics that might give Machiavelli an opening, okay, contact him and let him know. Okay? So that becomes important later on, that attitude towards fortune, which he believes needs to be addressed. And notice that he calls fortune she. Okay? Fortuna was the Roman goddess of chance, and she comes back in later on in the book. And so he very purposefully calls fortune, uses the female for fortune. Now, a lot of the letter has to do with Machiavelli's life out there in the countryside, and this is the pathetic part, okay? He's trying to get Francesco to feel sorry for him and want to rescue him from this situation. So he describes what his average day is like, okay? And he says, for instance, that he gets up in the morning and he puts on his rough country clothes and he goes out to check on the progress of the woodcutters to see what they're doing, make sure they're doing their job, because he made most of his income there on the estate from the wood, okay? Then after that, he says he goes to a spring, okay? A brook or something like that, and he sits down in a comfortable space and reads. Okay? But what he reads, he says down at the bottom of page 2, when I leave the wood, I go to a spring. From there to check my bird nets. I carry a book with me, Dante or Petrarch or one of the minor poets, perhaps Tibullus, Ovid, or someone like that. I read about their infatuations and their love affairs, reminisce about my own, and enjoy my reveries for a while. Okay, then I set out on the road to the inn. So this part of his day is not spent in reading for the sake of deep intellectual contemplation of politics, okay? But this is a man who also is interested in other things, okay? And is capable of entertaining himself in this way. Then he goes to the inn down the road a ways, and he tells us about how things are there. And he meets these people who come from all the walks of life of country people, you know, farmers and shopkeep and the artisan and whoever, okay? And he sits and has a drink with them and gossips and talks about what's going on, okay? And we don't think that this is like great political gossip from the city of Florence. This is more like, you know, what's going on in the local area, okay? And they play dice and other things, cards and so forth. He goes back and eats lunch with his family. He had a wife and several children, but then he goes back to the inn and he spends his whole afternoon there gambling, playing dice, playing cards, drinking more, and having a good time. And Machiavelli was a guy who liked to have a good time and, you know, enjoyed the company of others. And even though these people are not his ideal, he needs human beings enough that he is not going to stay at home all day and avoid human interaction. Yeah. But nevertheless, he does have an attitude towards them. He calls them bumpkins. Rude, crude, country bumpkins. Okay? He says, in the company of these bumpkins, I keep my brain from turning moldy and put up with the hostility fate has shown me. Okay. Now, it's interesting to me that somebody like Machiavelli would, I can understand that he sees the people this way, okay, because he, as I said, was a very urban person who enjoyed the city life, okay. But he's spending several hours a day with these folks. He's probably spending 5 hours a day at least with these folks at the inn, whom he calls bumpkins. Okay? So, it is somewhat surprising that he would do that rather than just simply be alone. Okay? But I think that's the extent to which Machiavelli needs other people and finds comfort in human contact. And the neat thing about what he does here, maybe inadvertently, is that he learns about the way the average, ordinary person out there thinks, what they're concerned about, okay, what worries they have, what attitudes they have towards those who have power and wealth, okay. He's collecting data still. He's still studying, and that comes out in the prints and in the discourses, that he understands something he would never have understood if he hadn't been out there, okay. And that is the common people's concerns, worries, their life, and what will please them, what will make them support a government, what will make them criticize it and not support it. So that becomes very important to him. In the evening, he goes home. He says he takes off his rude country clothes, all spattered with mud, and he puts on, he says, the regal robes, probably a dressing robe or something like that, and he gets himself cleaned off, and then he sits down and he has a conversation with somebody. But I'll show you where he says that. When evening comes, he says, I go back home and go to my study. On the threshold, I take off my work clothes, covered in mud and filth, and I put on the clothes an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. I'm not ashamed to talk to them and to ask them to explain their actions. And they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling any anxiety. I forget every worry. I am no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I live entirely through them. Okay. What's going on there? Obviously, he's not receiving lots of visitors, right? So what's he doing? This is one of the most famous passages from Machiavelli's writings because it places him in the context of the history of philosophy as how he saw himself. Okay. His equals are these people from the past, in his view. Okay. And he converses with them through the study of history. So he's reading Livy, he's reading Tacitus, he's reading Herodotus and Thucydides and all these other ancient historians and philosophers. Okay? And that's what he's describing as a conversation with them. And he's writing about them here as though they are his equals. These are the people that he can speak to, that he can understand. They aren't living today, okay? They're nowhere around, but he can converse with them through these books. This must be the time in which he writes as well. So he's reading and he's writing, and he hints to Francesco at the end of this that he is writing, but he doesn't say much about it. Okay, one more thing, and we'll go. Machiavelli, at the end of the letter, expresses worry about being called back by the de Medici somehow. He wants Francesco to help him. Okay? So, for instance, he says to Francesco, in favor of presenting it is the fact that the wolf is at my door. That is presenting what he's writing here. For my funds are running down, and I cannot continue like this much longer without becoming so poor I lose face. which means that to be embarrassed. In any case, I would like their lordships, the de Medici, to start putting me to use, even if they only assign me some menial task. For if once I am in their employment, I did not win their favor, I would have only myself to blame. Okay. So he's basically pleading with Francesco, let them know what I'm doing, that I'm writing, that I want to be of use to them, no matter what it is. Okay. So that's his message. Now, we have no evidence that that Francesco did help him. He may have. As I said, that may have been maybe why eventually he gets the call to write that history. But we have no evidence that Francesco reciprocated. Okay. All right. We'll see you on Thursday. Sure. Uh-huh.